Good evening, everybody, and welcome to VBC Greatest Generation Live. This is a special edition of our Monday night program because we have Dr. Craig Symonds with us, joining us from Annapolis, Maryland. Hello, Dr. Symonds. You gave me permission to call you Craig, and I will. Thank you very much. Glenn Flickinger will be the host of the conversation tonight. I just thought I'd say hello, welcome, everybody. I know that we have quite a few people joining us tonight who don't normally join us online, and maybe some people who maybe have never joined us. So I'll introduce myself. I'm Todd DiPastino. I am the director of the Veterans Breakfast Club. We're a nonprofit that has been around for 14 years, holding veteran storytelling programs in person and online. We have a Monday night program we call VBC Happy Hour, sometimes Greatest Generation Live, and where we just have conversations with veterans and encourage veterans to share their stories. This often gets us into history, and we are going to be covering some really important and fascinating history tonight. I always like to thank our sponsors. We have sponsors of our in-person and online programs, and tonight our sponsors are, I have to stop sharing here. Hold on a second. Because you're hearing all those ding-dongs, aren't you?
Yes.
Because I was sharing my sound.
Oh,
So you heard ding dongs. Okay.
it's the season.
Here we go. Okay. So this is D&D Auto Salvage. They have two locations here in Western Pennsylvania, one in Lawrenceville, one in Tarentum. I'm going to be heading there very soon. I have some metal that I've collected. And the great thing is when you go to D&D Auto Salvage and Metal Recycling and you bring some metal, they will pay you for it. Look at this. I got a shell. I got a howitzer, 105 howitzer shell. What is this, brass? Brass? Glenn, do you know?
I would think so, but I'm not sure.
Okay.
I'm not 100% sure.
I'm guessing it's brass. That probably weighs a few pounds. I could get some money for that. And D&D will also make a donation to the Veterans Breakfast Club for all the scrap metal that you bring. You could also go there for auto salvage. Go to dndautosalvage.com. That's dndautosalvage.com. And you can look up their current rates. We also are very grateful to Adagio Health, especially their tobacco-free program. They have started to show up at our in-person events. We're very grateful about that. And they sponsor our online programs here on Monday nights, especially tobacco-free Adagio Health. They are a wing of Adagio Health. Adagio Health serves families and women, especially they're looking to decrease the tobacco use here in the United States, and they're targeting especially veterans for this. They have a 1-800-QUIT line, 1-800-QUIT-NOW, and where they help counsel people to quit. And they also encourage policies that encourage, I should say, healthier places to live, work, and play. You could learn more by going to tobaccofree.adagiohealth.org. That's tobaccofree.adagiohealth.org. I want to let people know that we'll be back next Monday, a week from tonight. We're going to have our end of the year open conversation. Please do join us. Here we just discuss anything that you have in mind. We get into some fun and fascinating conversations. So please bring the topic. We'll supply the platform. I certainly have a lot of questions and subjects that I want to discuss on December 19th. That's a week from tonight, 7 p.m. Eastern. And if you live in Western Pennsylvania, we're having our last in-person event also here on Saturday, December 17th at Christ United Methodist Church on Highland Road in Bethel Park. This is a big one. We usually get up to about 200 people for our end of year program on a Saturday morning. We have a lot of kids, especially sixth graders, who are going to be coming, paying tribute to our veterans. So please do join us if you can. We'd love to have you join us. Just let me know you're coming. You could email me, Todd, Todd, at veteransbreakfastclub.org. All right, without further ado, I'm going to throw it to Glenn. Thank you, Glenn, for hosting tonight.
Okay, my pleasure. I'm glad to see we have such an excellent audience tonight. And maybe like Todd, just to introduce myself, I'm on the board of directors of the Veterans Breakfast Club. So I have that capacity. And my other capacity is the host and producer of Greatest Generation Live, which Todd gave me the privilege to start 2 years ago now, Todd. Hard to believe.
Wow.
And we've had the great opportunity to interview probably 15 World War II veterans that are still with us, which has been fascinating. And we've also had the opportunity to interview quite a few of are most prominent history writers of World War II. And tonight we have, I would think, the preeminent naval history writer of World War II, Dr. Craig Symonds. And Craig gave us the okay to call him Craig. Craig, welcome tonight. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Glenn. Happy to be here. Look forward to this conversation.
I am too. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. So let me just real quick, we could have taken the first 15 minutes to introduce Dr. Symonds, but because his list of accomplishments are very long. But let me just read this from the jacket of the book. Craig L. Symonds is Professor Emeritus at the United States Naval Academy, where he taught naval history for 30 years, including 4 years as History Department Chair. From 2017 to 2020, he was the Ernest J. King Distinguished Professor of Maritime History at the U.S. Naval War College. He's the author of 17 books, including Decision at Sea, Lincoln and his Admirals, The Battle of Midway, World War II at Sea, A Global History, and of course, most recently, this book. There's the jacket. I'm ashamed to show you the book itself because it's so dog-eared and full of my notes. I'll just show you the jacket. And I'll share it with you on screen in a moment. He's received numerous prizes, including the Lincoln Prize, the Roosevelt Prize, the Dudley Knox Medal for Lifetime Achievement. Wow. Dr. Craig Symonds, what a pleasure and what an honor it is to have you here.
Well, thank you, Glenn. I'll try to live up to that in our conversation.
No problem, I'm sure. No problem. So let me share the screen again here, Todd. We take care of that little chore, because I did prepare some slides to help guide us through this conversation. And okay, how'd I do? Is it up there?
There it is. I can see it.
Okay. So this is the jacket of the book. I think this comes actually from the audio book, but I love the title, Nimitz at War, Command Leadership.
Tokyo.
Yeah,
it's not a full biography. It's not a birth to death story, although obviously there are occasions when it's necessary to kind of flash back to earlier events or flash forward, if there is such a thing, to subsequent events. But it really focuses on Nimitz as commander of the Pacific Theater. And that's what I wanted to focus on, which is why it's about command leadership. How did he do this? He's thrown into this job at arguably the worst moment of the war. The fleet is on the bottom mud of Pearl Harbor. Things are going bad for the Allies globally, and he's asked to kind of make this thing work and do what he can. He stays in this job from the day he arrives, which is New Year's Eve, 1941, until he's present on board the Missouri in 1945 to sign the instrument of surrender. And in that time, he literally turns the war around. And to do that, he has to confront some pretty difficult personalities, both above him and below him and around him. So I think leadership command, or command leadership, if you prefer, is the central theme of the book. That was my hope.
And it obviously it comes through very well, Craig. Those of us that are interested in leadership, the study of leadership, this is an excellent study in leadership for any kind of leader out there, whether it's military, business, government, whatever, right? And the question I have is what was it about his background that led him to, one, to be chosen for this position at that time, and two, that gave him the skills, the capabilities to have that kind of command leadership quality?
Well, it is interesting because you're showing a picture here of him as a plebe, a 17-year-old callow youth out of the hills of Texas, showing up in Annapolis, never seen the ocean before, but here he is at the Naval Academy, confronting this wider world. I think we can say safely that there are a variety of types of leaders, and you probably need a variety of types of leaders. I kind of divide in some of my writings between those who are essentially the people you want at the front of the point, on the tip of the point of the spear. You got Halsey and Patton and people like that who you want out there bludgeoning the enemy. But you also want people who are overseeing the entire conflict from a kind of bird's eye view, a 20,000 foot overview, and have the kind of temperament necessary to monitor, direct, guide the people who are at the point of the spear. And Nimitz, like Eisenhower, like George Marshall, perhaps, was one of those people. So I think it's an element of his personality. It's an element of his temperament, whether that comes out of his growing up in the hills of Texas, or it's simply part of the personality that he was. It's very clear that he was more of a listener than a talker. He very seldom banged his fist on the desk or raised his voice or in any way was confrontational, and yet somehow he managed to maneuver himself and those in his command into positions that gave them the best opportunity to be successful. So I think it's a temperament issue as much as it is anything else.
And one of the elements of the book that I just loved, we have here a picture of him with his fairly, I think, newlywed wife, Catherine.
Yeah.
Married in 1913, sorry.
Yeah.
And the letters between the two of them during the war seemed to reveal an awful lot about the man. What did you come to understand more about the man from those letters?
Yeah, it's the private letters. It's the private man that you want to know. You know what he did officially. You can look at the orders that he wrote, and for that matter, the orders he received. You can look at the write-ups of the command center. But, if you want to understand who the man was, the private letters, where he doesn't expect people to be reading this 70 years later, but here we are. He wrote a letter to his wife, Catherine, every day for 1,351 days during his period of command in the Pacific Theater. Every day. Now, the problem with that is that she burned most of them. I know. It's a tragedy for those of us interested in history. We weep to think about that, but enough of them survived. The first about 14 months survived. Then again, they pick up in late 1944 and go through the end of the war. There's a big chunk missing in the middle, but there are other letters that help us fill in that blank. But there are enough of them to give us a strong sense of who he was. He was an introspective man. He thought about not just the problem he faced, but the problem behind the problem he faced. And he unburdened himself to his wife in talking about these things. And it's extraordinarily helpful. I have to tell one quick story, which is kind of a cute thing. When I was in the Washington Navy Yard at what's now called the NHHC, the Naval History and Heritage Command. It used to be the Naval History Center, and prior to that was the Naval History Division, but it's essentially the same organization. They are the keeper of the Navy's archives. And I asked for these letters, and they brought them out to me in those gray boxes that archives use to store important materials. And I looked at at the label on the side of the box, and it says it was the Nimitz Dairy rather than the Nimitz Diary. I don't know if it still says that or not, but it amused me, made me smile every time I saw it, going through those letters. They're really quite wonderful. And in addition to those letters, of course, there are a scattering of letters from his sons and from others, from friends, of course, that help you fill in some of those blanks. But yeah, the private letters are crucial.
Had any other authors read those letters before and included them?
Oh, I'm sure. I'm absolutely positive that my predecessor at the Naval Academy, Ned Potter, read those letters. I don't have a doubt in my mind. Potter, for those who don't know, E.B. Potter, wrote a full biography of Chester Nimitz called simply Nimitz. Now, Potter did not have access to a lot of things we know now. It was still classified, for example, that we had broken Japan's code. So that was a piece of information, a segment of his analysis that he didn't have access to. But But Ned Potter did a great job. And he knew Nimitz personally. I mean, he and Nimitz worked together on the book called Sea Power. That was still the text for midshipmen when I arrived at the Naval Academy as a professor in 1976. So he knew Potter personally, had worked with him. So that helped, I think, inform his view of Chester Nimitz. And Ned and I had a lot of conversations about the Nimitz family. And of course, I've met and talked with a number of the next generation of the Nimitz family. The twin grandsons in particular, Chet and Dick, are a wonderful resource. They recall climbing on Grandpa's lap. So that's wonderful. But the short answer to your question is, I'm sure I'm not the first one to look at those letters. And I know that Ned did, and I expect that others have as well, but it's still a great source.
Did he have access to the Nimitz Gray Book?
Well, of course, the Gray Book, as it's called, and you see here, I see you have on the screen some of those file boxes that archives use to store these things. The Gray Book, as it was called, apparently was initially bound in gray. It's in blue binding now inside those boxes. But I think what Nimitz wanted, and he did have an historical sensibility, what he wanted was to have a record in hand to keep track of the messages that came in and the messages that went out. And he also deputized a member of his staff, initially Captain Steele and then others subsequently, who would write down essentially a memoir, if you would, minutes of the daily staff meetings. He had a staff meeting every morning at 9 o'clock. And they would write down what they talked about, the news that came in, what they were considering. So you really get to be kind of a fly on the wall and see what they were discussing and talking about. And Nimitz went, and then they would be typed up every day and sent to Nimitz's desk, and he would read through them. And if he thought that, no, that's not really what I meant, he would make a little note in the margin. And those are invaluable. When, for example, there's a comment about Frank Jack Fletcher not really doing his job, Nimitz crosses that out and writes something else in the margin. So now we really get an insight, not only into what's being discussed at his headquarters, but how he feels about what's being discussed. So the Gray Book is an invaluable source. Now, we see these boxes here. There were 8 volumes of these on that tissue paper, carbon copy stuff. Unless you're old enough to remember tissue paper and carbon copy, you won't even know what I'm talking about. But so they're very thin, quite fragile papers as you turn them carefully. But thankfully, folks at the Naval War College digitized this into first a CD, but now they're available online. You can actually type in to your search engine, Nimitz Gray Book, and you can read those messages in the same way that Admiral Nimitz did 70 years ago.
Yeah. Todd, did you have another image you wanted to throw up about that? I stopped the share from my side, so.
Yeah, I just shared the link where you could access the Nimitz Gray Book here. I will share it here. It's the ibiblio.org link. All 4,030 pages of it are available in 8 volumes. I assume they're PDFs. So if for those of you who want to dig in, feel free to dig in. I'm sure it's searchable. I'm sure you could look up names and places and specific dates like that. So I shared it in the chat. I'll share it on the Facebook side too.
I just want to say, Todd, I can't resist saying, you young whippersnappers have it so easy these days, because when I did this research, I did not have that. So that's great. That's wonderful to have. Good.
Point of pride for Pittsburghers. I watched that ceremony where they revealed the digital copies and you spoke, Craig. Yeah. And it was a professor from Carnegie Mellon University.
Right.
Who worked on the digitization process.
That's easy for you to say.
Yeah, I know. I think I need a whiskey. And that was what I think 2014, as I recall.
That sounds right.
Yeah.
That sounds right.
Quite a resource. Now, I asked you before we started, but for our audience, are there other Gray Books of other field commanders out there? I mean, this is an incredible resource. Imagine if Eisenhower had one, or MacArthur had one, or whoever of these senior.
Yeah, the short answer to that is no. It would require someone who is in command at the top of the command pyramid who would say, I want this thing to be created. I want it to be kept in a single place. The thing about the Gray Book is it contains messages. Now you can find messages in other commands, messages in, messages out. And you can find in some cases where minutes of staff meetings were taken, but nowhere else is there a combination of all those things so that you can really participate in the high command decision-making as they occur. That's kind of unique to Nimitz's circumstances.
Is that used in any way at the academy to as a teaching vehicle?
Intermittently. One of the things, every midshipman takes a course in naval history. That's still true. It was true in Nimitz's day. It's true now. In some of those classes, and it's independent because we don't dictate to our instructors how exactly they should teach this course. Some require a research paper. Some have them do thought pieces in 3 5-page papers or 5 3-page papers. It depends on how they think they can best require the midshipman to deal with the material. But in those classes where research paper is required, there are cases where they'll say, you know, here's a place you can go, try to track down the messages back and forth in what? The Battle of Leyte Gulf, and figure out how this impacted the decision makers at the. So yes, that does happen, but there's no case where everybody does a particular project that involves the Gray Book.
Okay, interesting. Okay. Todd, let me pause there before we go to the next slide and the next set of questions. Are there questions in the chat room or anything you would like to ask, Todd? Up to
Yeah, I want to invite people to raise their hand, either like this or, you know, on Zoom to ask a question. I do see somebody put in the question or put in the chat, how did Nimitz get along with Marshall?
They didn't have a lot of interaction one to another. It's kind of interesting. I mean, the services, of course, there's no DOD in those times. There's no Department of Defense. So the Army and the Navy departments are entirely separate. It's like the Justice Department and the Post Office today. There's just not a lot of administrative overlap or chain of command overlap in that. Now, Marshall had the president's ear, which was very important, and Nimitz had the president's ear. So they each had a friend in court in that respect. And FDR knew Nimitz well because Nimitz had done 2 tours in Washington, D.C. as the head of the Bureau of Navigation, which sounds like it's how to navigate ships, but it's really not. Now we call it the Bureau of Personnel. It was the office where he assigned officers Navy-wide to all their responsibilities. So he, Nimitz, knew everybody in the Navy, and FDR considered himself a Navy man and liked to keep track of that. So he and Nimitz would get together and talk about, well, what about Captain so-and-so? Where would he work? So they knew each other quite well. And in the same way, FDR and George Marshall would deal with one another. But quite frankly, there's not many occasions when Marshall and Nimitz would deal with one another mano a mano, if you would.
I'm sorry, Glenn. We have another question, but if you want to, I don't want to interrupt you.
Well, just on that same theme with Marshall, is it accurate to think of Marshall and Nimitz in the same vein relative to, you know, Marshall's supposed black book that he kept for decades, as he rose through the ranks and kept track of prominent officers moving up? Did Nimitz have that same advantage in seeing all the captains and commanders? He
did. That's a great question. He did not keep a little book. George Marshall's little book is notorious, for example. He would keep track of this officer's an up-and-comer. We want to give him opportunities to excel. This officer, not so much. So maybe he'd be a great administrative person somewhere on a desk in Kansas City. But Nimitz did the same kind of thing without keeping the little book. He would require every ship that made port in Pearl Harbor. He would require every CO to come see him personally. And of course, by late 1942, and especially through 1943, there were literally hundreds of ships who would put in at Pearl Harbor before they went on to whatever campaign or adventure was on their list down the road. And they all came to see Nimitz, and he would talk with them, and more importantly, he'd listen to them. And his aide, Hal Lamar, recalled him saying, "We're going to watch that one. He's a comer." Or, "How did he ever get command?" So in a way, he did keep track of this. And even prior to the war, when he was chief of the Bureau of Navigation, because he had been through the file of literally every officer above the rank of lieutenant, he knew these guys already. So yeah, he kind of kept track of who was who and where they were going, but he did not keep a little book, or if he did keep a little book, it's never surfaced.
Right.
Craig, we have a neighbor of yours, a teenage Trey Berman, who is a sophomore in high school in Annapolis. Trey, and is looking forward to a Navy career. Trey, what's your question?
Yeah, thank you. Sorry that I don't have my camera on. It's broken right now. But I was wondering, first off, when were you at the academy, and if you still are? Because I mean, if you still are, I'd love to talk to you. But second off, I'm reading your book. I've been reading it in the past couple of weeks, and it's amazing. But I'm kind of at this part where Admiral King is taking control over the fleet that I believe is in the Battle of the Coral Sea. And you kind of talk about Nimitz's reaction to that and how he kind of just bore through it. But I was wondering about kind of the more like personal emotion that was happening during, like, what did Nimitz personally feel? Because I recall in your book, you kind of said like, oh yeah, he tolerated it.
Yeah. Thank you for your question, Trey. To answer the first part of your question, I taught at the Naval Academy from 1976 until 2005. Then I went back again in 2011 at the invitation of the department to hold the class of 57 chair. And I want to say the class of 57, you think about classes and the gifts that they give to their alma mater. Some of them give, a bench or a drinking fountain or whatever. The class of 57 got together and raised a lot of money to sponsor a naval historian to teach naval history at the academy. And they did it for 20 years or more. Wonderful program. But in any case, that's when I was at the academy. Now, in terms of Nimitz's relationship with Admiral King, we talked just a few minutes ago about how important the temperament was of a department commander, or a commander at any level for that matter, in dealing with his subordinates. But it's also important in dealing with his superiors. And King was Nimitz's immediate superior, and King was imperious. King was a guy who wanted things done right now, and he wanted them done his way. Not an easy man to work for, which is why it's crucial for somebody like Nimitz, who worked for him, to listen to him, to understand why it's necessary to be, shall we say, agreeable on those cases when it's necessary. But it's also necessary to stand up to him when he's becoming a bit too imperious. And it's a fine line. And it's a line that Nimitz walked beautifully. The picture that Glenn had on the screen a minute ago of the three people standing together, that's Nimitz on the left as we look at it, King in the middle, and then Raymond Spruance on the right. And Spruance was a guy we haven't talked about yet. He was Nimitz's chief of staff for 14 months, but he was also commander of the Big Blue Fleet, the Fifth Fleet, during the Central Pacific Drive and some of its most important combat operations. And Spruance was very much a man in the mold of Chester Nimitz, except he couldn't quite tolerate fools. And I'm not trying to imply that King was a fool, but he couldn't tolerate folks benignly in the way that Chester Nimitz could do. But Nimitz, I think, had a great gift in being able to know how far he could push back profitably to gain the thing that needed to be done for the success of the Navy without risking or jeopardizing the relationship he had with his boss. It's interesting that when Nimitz got that job in the last day of 1941, he wrote his wife in one of those private letters, "I'll be lucky if I last 6 months." But of course, he lasted the entire war, a very difficult thing to do when you're working for Ernest J. King and with Douglas MacArthur, and yet he survives all that. So I think that too is a measure of Nimitz's ability to understand what needed to be done and how it needed to be done to get the best things done, not for himself, not to put his name in the newspapers, but to get things done for the benefit of the Navy and the nation.
Just a comment there as I read your book, Craig. If I were in a position where I was helping to hire C-level executives for a company, I would never look at two men so opposite and think that they could work together.
Yeah.
So opposite in temperament, in background, et cetera, et cetera. Just it's an incredible attribution to Nimitz, his ability to be flexible, his ability to get along at the right times and to choose when to be tough.
I think that's absolutely true, but let's not fall into the trap of saying King was a bad man. No. He was a great commander. He worked harder probably than anybody else in uniform during that war, but he was convinced that he knew what had to be done. You could say the same thing, I suppose, about Douglas MacArthur, absent the hardworking element. But King was a wonderful commander. It's just that he needed people like Nimitz to turn his views into reality, and Nimitz could do that.
So I'd like to go to this next slide, because to me, it's one of the keys of Nimitz's command leadership during the war, right? And I pulled this from an article I'm sure you're very well aware of, from a few years ago in one of the scholarly magazines. I can't remember which one, that deconstructed Nimitz's calculated risk.
Yeah.
So might just read this, because to me it was incredibly revealing. Right, in carrying out the task assigned in Operation Plan 29-42, which I believe is the Battle of Midway.
It is.
Yeah. You will be governed by the principle of calculated risk, which you shall interpret to mean the avoidance of exposure of your force to attack by superior enemy forces without good prospect of inflicting, as a result of such exposure, greater damage to the enemy. This applies to the landing phase as well as during preliminary attacks. C.W. Nimitz. When did
this concept, in a way, it is a distillation of the general view that we, when I was on the faculty at the Naval War College, try to imbue in our students. For those not aware, the Naval War College is kind of a postgraduate program for those who are already at the 05, 06 level and about to assume flag responsibilities. So they're learning not how to make the engine work. They're learning how to employ naval or other forces, for that matter, to achieve the objectives of the national government. And in that respect, it's important to take into consideration this whole question of how much to risk to gain what. And if you can value the objective, whatever it might be, the seizure of an island, the defeat of a fleet, against what it's likely to cost you, you can make a judgment, a dispassionate, calculated judgment about whether the application of that force is appropriate to the value that you attached to completing it. It sounds very simple, and yet in the midst of combat, it's a hard thing to do. Take that hill at all costs. Wait a minute. Let me think about that. Really? Take that hill at all costs? There may be circumstances where that's appropriate, but there are a lot of circumstances when it is not. And in this particular case of the one you cited here, it is that we are committing 3 of our carriers, our last floating carriers in the Pacific, against 4 Japanese carriers. Now, we've got an advantage because they don't know where we are, and we think we know where they are. But on the other hand, if things seem not to be working out, we cannot afford to allow our 3 carriers to be jeopardized in the defense of this crummy little atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. If things are not going well, get out of there, right? Don't commit greater forces, the value, to achieve an object that has lesser value than the force being protected. So it's not an algorithm. It's not really a formula. There's no, despite the term, there's no calculation involved. It's a sensibility. It's an understanding of how much risk you can afford to take to achieve an object that has a presumed value that you attach to that. And then you make a calculation as to whether or not that risk is appropriate.
And remembering for all of us that this was the instructions, the orders given, but in an age when communications were not what they are today, which is instant.
Yeah.
Had to be given.
Yeah, keep in mind that when Nimitz gave orders to a commander going off into the fleet, that commander then operated under radio silence. So he's there. You'll hear nothing from him. Once he's over the horizon, as far as you're concerned, he's gone, right? You can send him information and he can receive that. But the minute he gets on the radio to respond or ask a question, the Japanese know where he is because of radio triangulation. So he's operating under radio silence. So in a way, he's out there as the decision maker. So whatever Nimitz says to him before he goes is critical, because now he's going to base that subsequent decision making on what Nimitz has said to him. And as we just saw with the calculated risk formula, I'm trusting you to make a calculated judgment about the value of your force, the value of the objective, and how much to risk and how much not to risk. It's a very complicated situation.
And what that leads into is the picture up here is Nimitz and Halsey, right? And the next picture is the famous picture of Nimitz and Spruance.
Right.
And I would imagine those two men had very different understandings of that concept of calculated risk.
I think that's fair. And again, it goes back to temperament. Nimitz liked and trusted both of them. There's a wonderfully revealing letter that Chester Nimitz's son, also named Chester Jr., who became a Navy captain, and no doubt would have been an admiral had he not had some health problems, that Chester Nimitz left behind, in which he said, my father always said to me, when it was a delicate landing that required coordination with many forces and you had to make complicated decision making, my dad wanted Spruance in command. When it was a cavalry charge and the devil take the hindmost, that was Halsey. So these two guys, both of whom worked for Nimitz, very different personalities, but he knew that and tried to give them jobs pertinent to their particular strengths.
Yeah. Was it Nimitz who came up with the idea of alternating the two in charge of the same fleet, just renaming the fleet?
Yeah, it took place in a staff meeting that Nimitz was presiding over, but it wasn't actually his suggestion. It came from others when they were talking about Nimitz. Spruance took over from Halsey famously on the eve of the Battle of Midway, even though he did not wear the gold wings of an aviator, and this was clearly going to be a carrier confrontation. And performed so well that he stayed in that job through the next several operations, the taking of Tarawa, the movement to the Marshall Islands, and so on. But then Halsey got well. I mean, that's a good thing. Halsey got over his probably shingles. We don't know for sure, but that's a reasonable guess, and was ready to report back to the fleet. Nimitz gave him command initially of the South Pacific, replacing Bob Gormley in that job. But then when the South Pacific was pacified and Halsey was available, the question is, well, how can we take advantage of the obvious skills that this commander has? Because Spruance has done such a good job. And the idea came up, well, there's a planning period between operations. Why don't we have one conduct one operation while the other one plans? Then they'll switch, and the new guy can take the plan out there and execute the next operation. It's an interesting development. Halsey, in his memoir, says, you know, in the old days in the stagecoaches, they used to change the horses at every station. Well, now what we do is we change the driver and we keep the horses.
Yeah.
The problem is that's pretty hard on the horses. Those guys are out there conducting operations all the time. A new guy comes in and says, okay, next operation, let's go. So it wasn't necessarily Nimitz's idea, but he saw quickly how it was an opportunity to take advantage of the particular skills of each of his subordinates.
Great, great. So I thought what we do next, and Todd, please stop me if there's questions that you think we ought to put to Craig from the audience, but I have some photos of 4 or 5 of his other direct reports, some of the commanders from the Marine Corps, some from the Army. And if you could perhaps just comment on his relationship with these men for us.
Sure.
Okay. So here we have the Marines, which all our Marine friends, all our Marine members will appreciate, which we have many. On the left is the Commandant of Marines at the time, General Holcomb. And then his next, the Commandant starting in 1944, I believe, January 1 of 44, Vandergrift. At this point, this is the Battle of Guadalcanal. And I believe that's Edson in the middle. But how did Nimitz get along with the Marines? After all, that was those were his men, his soldiers, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. Now remember, when we
Right.
talk about the divided command in the Pacific, MacArthur commanding the Southwest Pacific, Nimitz commanding the Pacific Ocean area, which was 6 times the size of MacArthur's command. Each of them commanded all the forces within their command. So Nimitz didn't just command the Navy and the Marine Corps. He commanded the Army and the Army Air Corps in his theater. But he had a particular affection for the Marines. He knew the Marines were the point on the spear of all those operations that he conducted at Tarawa, at Kwajalein, at Iwo Jima, not at Okinawa, that was the Army, but in a lot of the very difficult campaigns. And the one that wounded him the most, I think, was Peleliu. He had an opportunity to call off the Peleliu landing. He had promised MacArthur that he would take Peleliu and the Palau group because it would cover MacArthur's right flank as MacArthur moved into the Philippines. But when the calendar of operations was accelerated, it became clear that Peleliu might kind of be a backwater. But when that decision was made, the invasion fleet was already at sea. The UDT, what we now call SEALs, the frogmen, had already been on the beach preparing the landing area, and he let it go. And the Marines went ashore there. And the Japanese had adopted a new tactic of staying in their caves and making the Marines come in and get them. Now, what the Marines had that the Army did not in the Pacific War, the Marines' philosophy was get in quickly, fast, get it over with as fast as you can. That will reduce the total number of casualties. The Army's view was do this step by step to keep casualties low. It may take longer, but in the long run, we'll have fewer casualties. You could make an argument for either one of those, but there was a tension between the two. And Nimitz sympathized with the Marines at least as much as the Army. He got frustrated, for example, on Okinawa when the Army was moving more slowly than he wished it did, because all that time his ships were being hit by the kamikazes. Right. So he did get along well with the Marines. He visited Guadalcanal at the height of those operations. He gave the Navy Cross, which is as high as he could go, to Red Mike Edson, whom we saw in the previous photograph. This is Howling Mad that we're looking at here, Holland M. Smith.
The all-time greatest nickname of World War II.
Yeah, well, H.M. Smith, you know, Howling
Mad.
Howling Mad.
Who was the source of a great deal of that tension.
He was. And of course, the culmination of that tension was on Saipan.
Yes.
When H.M. Smith, and this gets very confusing, of course, because there's several Smiths involved. H.M. Smith, Howling Mad Smith, the Marine general, 3-star, relieved of command the commander of a Army division, a 2-star, just fired him in the middle of a battle. Well, you can imagine what emerged from all of that. And Nimitz, I don't know this for a fact, but I have the sensitivity to believe that he thought to himself, oh, great. Did you really have to do this? Look at the problem you've created for me in trying to resolve this dilemma. But Nimitz, being Nimitz, did resolve the dilemma. He found a new job for Ralph Smith. He transferred H.M. Smith to a job where he would never again command Army soldiers. So he managed to get through it, but Howling Mad Smith made his life difficult, as other of his subordinates did as well.
Yeah. And this is a picture of a general I was not very familiar with, but he's mentioned in your book and some other books I've read. I looked him up, and that's General Richardson. Do I have that right? Yes.
Yes, Richardson. Richardson took over as the senior Army officer in the Pacific. So technically he's under Nimitz's command. You see Nimitz with 4 stars, Richardson with 3, but these are separate services. So Richardson feels it's his job to be the den mother, if you would, of all Army generals in the Pacific theater, even though he too is subject to Nimitz's command. He would complain to Nimitz when Nimitz made a decision involving soldiers. And Richardson would say, well, now how can you give soldiers orders? And Nimitz would have to very carefully explain to him, well, I command everything in this theater, including you, General. But Richardson was a problem for Nimitz during the Smith versus Smith controversy, because he naturally enough, I suppose, took up the cause of Ralph Smith, the Army general who was dismissed by H.M. Smith, the Marine Corps general who dismissed him, and made it a kind of cause celeb. And it had the potential of making it into the public newspapers and getting all the way up to Washington and causing all sorts of difficulties at a time when Nimitz was trying as hard as he could to make the idea of joint command and joint operations a functioning vehicle for victory. So Richardson caused problems for him, but they're problems that emerged out of the attitude among the services that I look out for my own. You know, we're the good guy. I just survived a not very happy Army-Navy football game last Saturday, so I can understand fully how they felt.
Yeah, Nimitz, the patient of Job, right?
Patience of Job. I think that's appropriate.
And then one last man, and we'll open it up for questions again, Todd, because this man reminds me of somebody I worked with 20 years ago in my corporate banking days, and that man, who will remain unnamed, of course, was an irritant in my side every day for 3 years. And this man, Admiral Towers, had to have been an irritant to Nimitz every day of his command.
Well, he's not only an irritant to Nimitz, he was initially an irritant to King. Jack Towers was the senior Army Air Force general in World War II. Admiral in World War II. And his view was no admiral, no officer in the Navy at any level should be in a position to give orders to an aviator unless he was an aviator. And he pushed that in Washington as hard as he could and convinced a lot of people in Congress and in the Joint Chiefs that this was a reasonable position to take. But of course, it strikes at the heart of the idea of joint and coordinated operations. So King found him difficult, and King wanted to get him out of Washington, because as long as he was in Washington, he had the ear, in particular, of Congressman Carl Vinson, who was head of the Naval Affairs Committee in Congress, and a very powerful voice. So King was eager to get Towers out of Washington, and what he did was assign him to Nimitz as his deputy commander. And Nimitz already had problems with Towers. They had clashed before the war over a number of issues. There's a wonderful letter that Nimitz writes to Catherine, in which he says, Jack Towers is going to be my deputy commander. Then there's a ... and he says, never mind, we'll manage to get along. So, there's a lot of unsaid stuff in that ... But Nimitz put up with it because he had to, because he was doing King a favor. There were a few occasions when he had to take Towers down a peg, when Towers overstepped his responsibility. I am convinced that one of the reasons Nimitz moved his headquarters from Pearl Harbor to Guam in January of 1945 was not only to be closer to the front, absolutely that, yes, but also because then he could leave Towers behind in Pearl Harbor and he wouldn't have to deal with them every day. So yeah, again, back to the patience of Job. Nimitz tolerated Towers because he had to, because he was doing King a favor, because there was no way out of this. But he also found a way to kind of crawl out from under that burden when he could.
Yeah, I did get that irritant in my side transferred to another city at one time. So
well played, Glenn.
Common political play. Todd, let's pause and see what questions there might be from the audience or in the chat room.
We have a couple of esteemed historians in their own right who have questions. Jeff Ballard, number one. Jeff, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Symonds, it's very, very nice to meet you. I've enjoyed your books for a number of years.
You're very kind. Thank you. I'm honored.
I have a couple of questions, actually.
Sure.
Actually, I have hours and hours worth of questions. But first of all, I read, and I cannot put my finger on it, at one point that Nimitz intended to conduct economic warfare against the Japanese by attacking their fishing fleet. Now, as part of my master's thesis, I had an opportunity to look through the Gray Book. I never found any reference to that plan. I wondered if you know, or if you could recommend a source where that was documented, because I'd love to conduct some more research on that.
Yeah, no is the short answer. Now, the reason we infer that is because what happened in 1945 was the American submarines in particular, but other forces as well in the Pacific, were being so efficient in wiping out the Japanese lines of communication between the South Pacific, the oil and tin and rubber and all the things they had gone to war to get, had to be shipped by sea up to Japan, and the American submarines were just ravaging that. And so there were fewer and fewer targets for them. When Halsey was sent by Nimitz to destroy as much Japanese maritime shipping as he could, he was frankly running out of targets. The Japanese were so desperate, they were using rafts at night to bring supplies into the home islands. So Halsey took it upon himself to attack and sink every ship that he possibly could. I mean, even fishing ships, if they could be used to bring supplies into Japan, were, as far as Halsey was concerned, a legitimate target. But I don't think Nimitz ever told him, sink the fishing ships so that the Japanese civilians will starve. That was not a part of his grand strategy. It was, by implication, part of his strategy in that if we can cut Japan off from all of its imports, not only will their war industry break down, their entire economy will break down. And when that happens, they will recognize their utter inability to continue this war and bring it to an end. Now, of course, that was always the hope. And we can get into more about why that didn't happen later on. But the short answer to your question is, I don't think Nimitz, to my knowledge, Nimitz did not ever say, let's destroy the fishing fleet so that the Japanese civilians have nothing to eat. He did say, destroy all of their maritime commerce so they can't import the materials of war. And operational commanders stretched that to include anything that floated with the rising sun on its mast.
Great, thank you. My last question was just what in your mind is story that has yet to be told about the war in the Pacific.
The story that's yet to be told. Good heavens. I mean, if I knew that, I'd have written a book about it. I don't know. Have you got one?
I'm looking.
Okay, good.
We have another esteemed historian, Jared Frederick, my Pennsylvania neighbor. Jared, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Todd. Glad to be here.
And you put a question in the chat. Why don't you ask it here?
Yeah. Good evening, Craig. How are you?
Hi, I'm fine. Thank you. This is fun. What you got?
Well, a few years ago, you and I did a little conversation at Gettysburg on the parallels of the Civil War and World War II. And my question is along those same lines. In looking through all of Nimitz's records, is there any sort of introspection on his part about naval history? Did he look back on the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, World War I as a compass for his decision-making, or was his the practical look at history very much in the present?
Mostly the latter. We know that he was historically sensitive. I tell the story in the book about how Nimitz's decision not to reveal the inaccuracy, not to say blatant lying, of Mitcher's report after Midway was based on his unhappiness that the controversy after the Spanish-American War had led to a lot of airing of dirty laundry, shall we say, concerning the United States Navy. And he didn't want to do that. He would prefer not that all of the laundry be transparently exhibited, but rather that we remember the good things that happened. And part that's in the middle of a war. Now, whether the war is over, he never did change from that. As I mentioned, he and Ned Potter worked together very closely on the development of this book, Sea Power, 1961 edition. It's out of print now, but still available in various copies. There were tens of thousands of them printed. And it's an entire history, not only of the United States Navy, but of all navies from dugout canoes to the present, or at least up to 1961. And we see no evidence that Nimitz wanted to do anything except explain what was good about what the Navy had done. I mean, if there was a mistake, such as the landing at Gallipoli, he would willingly explore that. But he never brought up the Sampson-Schley controversy. He never brought up the fact that Midway had not gone exactly as scripted. And part of your question is, did he take lessons from history and apply them to his own circumstances? If so, it's not evident in his letters or his writing. Whether he thought "damn the torpedoes" was a fine sentiment and used that, I could not tell you. He certainly never made reference to it.
Thank you. I look forward to reading the book.
Yeah, good. Hope you enjoy it.
I just put in the chat one of your wonderful articles, Craig, on Mitcher and the Mystery of Midway,
Oh, yeah.
U.S. Naval Institute. I put it in the chat there. That's from 2012. Greg Yost, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for this program. Thank you, Professor Symonds. I would, I tend to keep the formalities there. So enjoyable. I am also one of those people who could go on for hours, if not weeks, on this subject. So I will try to limit myself to 6 or 7 hours.
Okay.
But I had a very specific tactical question and then a very broad strategic question. I'll ask the tactical one first and maybe save the strategic one for later. In April of 1943, the U.S. got wind that Admiral Yamamoto was going to be touring the frontline bases to raise Japanese morale and make some decisions. And the U.S. thought that it could knew the plan of his itinerary well enough that they could jump him. Now, this was a long mission with no guarantee of success. These squads of U.S. planes showing up hundreds of miles from the nearest base would surely have tipped off the Japanese that some major breach of security, and without guarantee of success. Was that Nimitz's ultimate decision to make the call on this, to send the aircraft out to try to shoot down Yamamoto?
Yes, I'm convinced that it was. I know there's a lot of discussion. There had been some conversation among others that Nimitz kicked this question upstairs. that he sent it to King, and that King took it to the president, and the president and Frank Knox sat around in a midnight session and discussed the morality of, was this an assassination or was this a military operation, and so on. I tried really hard to find any evidence of that and could not. Now, of course, you could say, well, yeah, they were keeping it secret because it's a morality-based question and they didn't want their fingerprints on it. But the timing of the orders, when he got that information from Hypo, the code breakers, and then when he passed it down the line to Mark Mitcher, who by then was Air Sols, commander of Air Solomons, who passed it on down to the flight commanders themselves, the timing of the issuing of those letters doesn't leave room for a midnight morality-based conversation in the White House. So I think that's a myth. I think Nimitz made this decision himself. Eddie Layton in his memoir says that Nimitz looked up at him after he read the memo and said, shall we try to get him? And Layton claims that he said, well, yes, we should, because killing Yamamoto would be as devastating to the Japanese as killing you would be to us. Now, here's a subordinate kissing up to the boss, certainly. But then again, again, the timing of that supposed conversation and the timing of the orders that went to the P-38s that actually executed the mission suggests that Nimitz made this call himself at the time, that he decided that it was a legitimate military operation, and he covered it by putting out a cover story saying that a coast watcher had identified planes flying the length of Bougainville Island in the Solomons and had reported that back to the Americans, who then sent out a squadron of P-38s to investigate. And that story stood up. The Japanese did not change their codes. They never believed their codes were breakable until the war was over. So that's my answer to your question. I think Nimitz did it.
Todd, more?
I have a strategic question. If anyone doesn't have, it looks like someone else is raising a hand here.
Yeah, Bob's got his hand up. I can see that, but I also see there's 21 questions in the chat room. So I'm going to leave it to Todd to decide.
Yeah, Bob, why don't you ask your question? Oh, here. Let me see. I have to find Bob.
He's in the middle of my screen. Wave your hand, Bob. There he is.
Oh, Bob Flage, here you go.
There you go.
I'm going to ask you to unmute. Bob, there you go.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
We had reasonably good landings. You had mentioned landings earlier, Army, Marine, etc. And they were reasonably well run, except for the one that they ran upon the shoals. What was the outcome of that? Because they didn't know the tides and
Well, actually they did know. That's an interesting one. That's Tarawa, Baishio Island, Tarawa Atoll, the Gilbert Islands. There's a shelf, a coral shelf about 4 feet deep that runs out a quarter mile or more from the edges of the island itself. It's tiny little islands, 1 square mile. It's itty bitty, barely holds an airstrip. And we knew that. And we also knew that at this time of year, there could be what's called a neap tide. This is when the sun and the moon are at right angles to one another, so that the sun's gravitational force counteracts the pull of the moon, which is what creates tides in the first place, so that instead of 4 feet of water over the shelf, there was only 3 or even 2.5, which meant that the Higgins boats carrying the Marines to the beach grounded, many of them, on that coral shelf, and the Marines had to climb out and walk ashore in the face of Japanese machine gun fire. This absolutely infuriated Holland Smith, who had said beforehand that he wanted Amstracks or alligators, that is tracked landing vehicles, to carry his men over such an obstacle. And Nimitz used that to get the War Administration to double the number of tracked Amstracks being produced for the subsequent operations. But yeah, this was kind of a situation where everything went wrong that could. The tides were bad. The shelf was lower than expected. The Japanese, even though they've been shelled, for 24 hours and bombed and shelled, nevertheless were able to put up a pretty effective beach defense when the Marines came ashore. What a lot of people say about the terrible landing is that it was a case where we learned a lot of lessons. And I think that's fair enough. It was very costly, 1,000 dead Marines, 3,000 wounded. Of course, there were 5,000 Japanese killed, but even so, that's a heavy price to pay for 1 square mile of palm trees and sand. It might have derailed the Central Pacific Drive altogether if subsequent operations had not gone so much better. But they went so much better in part because of the lessons learned at Tarawa, and not just the coral shelf problem, but also the inefficacy of sort of random shelling of an island. I think the big battleships and heavy cruisers thought that if they just shelled the hell out of this little tiny island, there wouldn't be any Japanese left alive. And what they learned was you have to use direct armor-piercing ordnance on specific sites. You can't just throw ordnance onto an island and expect it to do the job. But I'm getting a little bit off topic. But yeah, that was the terrible landing, and there were lessons learned there.
Was there any recall or any recourse to anybody because of it?
Did anybody pay a price for it? Not really. Holland Smith got his tracked vehicles. I think there was a lot of concern. Harry Hill, who was in charge of the bombardment, wrote one of the most sophisticated and thoughtful after-action reports of the entire war in explaining why area bombardment by heavy guns, even 14-inch shells from the old battleships, was not going to do the job. You had to have specific sites and a coordinate. Nimitz himself oversaw the creation of essentially a grid, alphanumeric numbers on one side, numbers on the, and that, so that you could assign specific targets, not just to specific ships, but even to specific guns on those ships. Your responsibility is to take out this 8-inch gun at these coordinates. Don't just throw the shells in there. Get that. That's your job. So no one actually, was dismissed or cashiered because of what had gone wrong at Tarawa, but rather collectively, everybody figured out, man, we took this a lot too casually.
Okay, thank you very much.
Craig, I think it's in your book about this point where the Navy actually set up a practice target island somewhere near Mine Islands.
Yeah.
Japanese style dugouts and shelling them.
I'll make a little bit of personal about this. For my wife and I celebrated our 50th anniversary at the same time as our son and his family were having an anniversary. So we all went to Maui. I mean, we don't do this kind of thing a lot, but from our hotel at Maui, you could look across a relatively narrow channel to the island of Kulawai. And Kulawai was the island that Nimitz selected to have the Seabees go in and build, after they looked at what was on Tarawa, to build Japanese redoubts using the same materials and the same construction techniques to build those redoubts, and then have ships fire at those. And after they do it for an hour and then lift fire, the Seabees would go back in and say, well, no, this and that. So yeah, it was not just, gee, we need to do better, but let's conduct experiments to find out exactly what works. Yeah, that was his initiative too.
Of course, the counter by the Japanese at Peleliu and Iwo Jima was just digging deeper and deeper and deeper.
Right. Well, you could do that on those volcanic islands where there were already deep caves built in that you could expand upon. A place like Baishio Island was simply a sand. You go 2 feet down, you're underwater.
Yeah. Todd, more, or should we push on?
Well, yes, I do have station identification here. This is the Veterans Breakfast Club, VBC Greatest Generation Live. I want to let people know that apart from doing the live programs, both online and in person, we publish a quarterly magazine called VBC Magazine. We'll actually be sending out our winter issue to the printer on Wednesday. And if we send this out to about 8,000 households, it's free of charge. Anybody who wants it can receive it. We send out boxes to other people. I know Cliff Pfeiffer has been passing them around in Colorado. This is how people learn about the Veterans Breakfast Club. So if you'd like to receive the magazine and you aren't yet, please just email me, todd@veteransbreakfastclub.org. That's Todd, T-O-D-D, @veteransbreakfastclub.org. And I also want to let people know we have a survey that we really value and pay very close attention to, Survey Monkey, where we just ask you, what do you think of this program? You know, rate it. Number 2, what did you like or dislike? Number 3, how can we improve? I did put that link there in the chat here on the Zoom side, and I'll do it on the Facebook side too. So thank you. If you could go to Survey Monkey and let us know how we're doing, would be much obliged.
Okay, let me share the screen again, Todd, and move on to what I thought would be perhaps 5 or 6 illustrations of Nimitz's command leadership, several of which we've already talked about. And of course, I had so many of these teed up, I knew we wouldn't get to them all. So I, in my own mind, just have a couple I'd like to ask Craig about that illustrates his growing command leadership abilities. And in some ways, Craig, and maybe I'm overdoing this, I think about and see the growing confidence that Nimitz had in himself. And it reminds me a little bit about the growing confidence that Eisenhower had in himself as the war progressed. Is that a fair analogy?
Yeah, I think so. It's interesting, you know, Eisenhower and Nimitz, I think, are of a type. And that is to say, what made Eisenhower a great value to the Allies is not that he could draw his sword and charge an enemy machine gun nest, but that he could bring together all the putative allies, the Americans, Canadians, Free French, who were very difficult to work with, and of course the British, and particularly if you're dealing with Monty Montgomery, he can be difficult to deal with too, and make sure that they all pulled on the same rope in the same direction. And Nimitz is the same way. And I think as they became increasingly adept at exercising that kind of leadership, they became increasingly confident. And another factor in this is that while Nimitz was concerned in his first 6 months on the job that the king might pull the rug out from under him at any moment, once he had a couple of victories under his belt, and victories that he himself had put his neck out to make happen, the Coral Sea and Midway, and in each of those, King was a little uncertain whether taking that risk was justified. In each case, it was Nimitz with the benign temperament who took the bold decision that, yes, it is, and he was right. And so having been right a number of times, that gave him increased confidence to stand up to King when he had to, and to a lesser extent to Douglas MacArthur. You can't really stand up to Douglas MacArthur because he would not take it well.
Yes.
But Nimitz developed a relationship with MacArthur as more or less an equal that allowed both of them to be successful within the range of their own commands. I'll say one more thing about Nimitz and Eisenhower. It's interesting to me, in early 1945, when Congress authorized the creation of a 5-star rank in both the Army and the Navy, that there were going to be 4 in each service who got that rank. And we know who many of them were, of course, Leahy for the Navy and King for the Navy, both Eisenhower and Marshall for the Army. But what rank would they have relative to one another? It's interesting to me that Nimitz, here's a piece of trivia you can trip people up on, Nimitz was 1 day senior to Dwight Eisenhower as a 5-star commander.
Yeah. I didn't know that until I read your book. In fact, each of the 5 stars, their seniority is given, as I recall.
Right, that's correct, yeah.
So one illustration that I just marveled over, because I didn't know the story as well until I read your book, was Nimitz's decision regarding the Marshall Island campaign.
Yeah.
And here is just a great illustration on this map of the two drives through the Pacific, MacArthur's, through New Guinea and the Philippines, the Central Pacific Drive. They get to after Tarawa. The next step is the Marshall Islands. And let me switch to that next map here. And there's a bit of a controversy within Nimitz's staff as to how to conduct this campaign. Could you?
Yeah. Well, remember that according to Plan Orange, which had been on the book in its earliest iteration since 1911. So here's a plan that the Navy's been looking at for as long as almost anybody in uniform has been alive, or at least since they've been commissioned. The idea was that the Central Pacific Drive would go from Pearl Harbor into the Marshall Islands.
Yeah.
But the Japanese at the beginning of the war captured the Gilbert Islands south of the Marshalls. So they thought, well, we're just getting started here. We're not sure how. So let's start at Tarawa. Tarawa was supposed to be a warm-up. Well, we've already discussed what happened at Tarawa. It was a near disaster and very costly. And there was a lot of conversation about, well, gee, we better be careful from now on. If we go straight to the Japanese main base at Kwajalein, that could be a disaster. Maybe instead we should attack the outer islands, the little ones, Malalope and Jaluit and some of these others that you can see on this map, because they're not such a tough nut to crack. And Nimitz said, no, I think we figured it out. We learned a lot of lessons. We're good to go. We're going to go to Kwajalein. And they said, well, Admiral, I'm not dumb. So he went around the room. He says, okay, let's vote. And he went around the room to each one, Spruance and Smith and all these guys, Kelly Turner. What do you think? Everyone said, no, the outer islands. We got to go to the outer islands first. Kwajalein is too tough. And this will tell you something about Nimitz. He says, thank you, gentlemen, for your input. I appreciate it very much. We're going to attack Kwajalein. Well, first of all, for a guy whose supposed reputation is this guy who goes along to get along, that's not what you see here. He was convinced, and of course, events proved him correct, that the lessons learned at Tarawa would allow them to take Kwajalein with reasonable costs. Here again, he's applying his cost-effective analysis, calculated risk. But Turner, the amphibious commander, and Spruance stayed after once the meeting was over, and they argued with him. First of all, here's a commander you can argue with. King is not one of those guys, by the way, but they felt comfortable to argue with him. Now, look, Admiral, here's the thing. And finally, after about 20 minutes of this, Nimitz says, look, gentlemen, this is it. We're going to Kwajalein. If you don't want to do it, I can find other commanders. Oh, well, in that case, yeah, we think it's a fine idea. Yeah. So they did go to Kwajalein. And in fact, the campaign worked out better than the prognosis initially indicated. So Nimitz was right. But the strength of his willingness to confront every single one of his subordinates to make that happen is, to me, a real insight.
Yes. I found it fascinating. It was the deepest I've ever read that story, and it's just so well related in your book. And it just reveals a lot about the man's leadership capabilities. Right?
It does. I agree.
Yeah. So another one that I'd like to jump to, and you can see I'm going to jump several of these cases that I brought up. Okay. I'd like to contrast, if we could, the Battle of the Philippine Sea with Spruance in command, and the events that took place there relative to Spruance not pursuing the Japanese carrier force. Okay. If you allow me to set this up, Craig.
Sure.
Versus the Battle of Leyte Gulf with Halsey in command of the Third Fleet, if I have that right at that point.
That's correct.
And Halsey's decision to abandon the San Bernardino Strait, allow the Japanese to threaten the transports at Leyte Gulf in pursuit of the Northern force, which was clearly a decoy.
Yeah.
At least 70, 85 years later, it's clearly a decoy. Easy for me to say, right? So my question is, those two situations and circumstances and the application of that calculated risk concept with two different commanders with two different temperaments, Spruance versus Halsey.
Yeah, it's
Nimitz is-
fascinating. It's one of the great set pieces of the whole war and all of naval history for that matter, because you have Spruance, who, the title of the biography that was written about him, The Quiet Warrior, and Halsey, who is the guy, if you'll recall from our earlier chat, that Chet Nimitz Jr. said was a guy for cavalry charges, are very different personalities. And in the middle of these is Pete Mitcher, Mark Mitcher, whose nickname was Pete, the little short guy here that you see in this photograph. Mitcher was the senior aviator in the Navy. He was naval aviator number 33, and he figured he knew what carriers were for. Carriers are offensive weapons. Their job is to go after the enemy fleet and sink it. And when Spruance told him during the landing on Saipan, no, I want you to remain within 200 miles of the landing beaches because our first job is to support the Marines ashore. And if the Japanese come in here with an end run, as they are prone to do, they always like these complicated plans, then we need you nearby to negate that. Well, Mitcher and most naval aviators thought Spruance was being too conservative here. He waited 24 hours, and then finally, when it was evident there was no end run, he released Mitcher to go get the Japanese. But by that time, the range was so great, he could only damage them slightly. His argument was, if you had let me go right away, I could have gone out there and sunk their whole fleet and this war would be over. Well, maybe not. So one of the people who agreed with that assessment was Halsey, who was also an aviator. Now, he didn't become an aviator until he was 52, but he did wear the gold wings of an aviator. And so his thought was that if I get a chance, and there you see the wings on his chest, if I get a chance, I want permission to go get the Japanese if an opportunity arises. And Nimitz put that in his orders. If an opportunity to destroy a major portion of the Japanese fleet arises, that will become your primary job. Well, the problem is the Japanese have 3 fleets here. What's a major portion of the Japanese fleet? To Halsey, that meant their carriers. So when the Japanese sent what's labeled here as the Northern Force down from the home islands with a couple of carriers, bereft of airplanes, they have almost no airplanes left because they were pretty much wiped out in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Their job is to decoy Halsey away from the landing beach so that what's labeled here as the Central Force, which are all surface ships, battleships, heavy cruisers, can get through San Bernardino Strait to attack the landing force in Leyte Gulf. And it's a long shot. It's a tremendous long shot. And amazingly, it does exactly what it's supposed to do. The big criticism of Halsey is not just that he went charging out after the Northern Force. There was another American fleet here. There was the 7th Fleet down there to protect Leyte Gulf. It's not as big as his, but there was one. The real fault is he left San Bernardino Strait naked. If he had left some battleships, if he had left a picket destroyer there by itself, it could have warned the forces off Leyte Gulf that the Japanese were coming through. Instead, he took everything with him north to confront the Northern Force. And that really is his big mistake. And you can't help but think, here's the cavalry charge. This is the kind of thing Halsey's made for. His eyes got as big as saucers. Oh my God, I'm going to get a chance to destroy the Japanese carrier fleet. I'll be a hero. He never admitted until the day he died that had been a decoy. He just would not allow anybody to say that, although everybody else knew that it was. So Halsey clearly made a mistake here. Nimitz knew that he'd made a mistake here. But Nimitz's problem is that Halsey has become a folk hero in America. To fire him or discipline him now in the wake of a tremendous victory, because Leyte Gulf did end up being a victory, to discipline Halsey now would diminish that victory, would diminish Halsey's public reputation as a hero of the war. And again, back to the reason that Nimitz did not want to air any of the Navy's dirty laundry in public. He thought it was better to just keep his mouth shut and never mind, let this go, because we won after all, and we don't have to pull Halsey's pants down in public just because he behaved badly.
The other element of this, Craig, that I'd love you to comment on, I mean, it's an incredible study in military communications for this age, because as related in your book, there's Nimitz sitting in Hawaii with his staff, and they're hearing some of this traffic up to the point where they finally figure out that Halsey has left the San Bernardino Strait naked, right? And I believe this is the point where Nimitz's son, Chester Jr., is there.
Yeah.
And he's kind of wondering in his head, Dad, what, if you could hear him think, he'd probably said, Dad, what in the hell are you doing? Why aren't
Well, they didn't have the relationship where Chester would say, what the hell? But
Yeah.
he did say, he did kind of take his father on a little bit here, which is interesting. He was at dinner, he's visiting, he's on his way back to the States to pick up a new submarine command. He's just won the Navy Cross from his previous command. He was a very successful naval officer, and he's having dinner with his father and his staff. And everybody's really nervous, and he says, what's everybody so nervous about? And it's the new chief of staff who tells him, well, we don't really know if Halsey's left San Bernardino Strait unguarded. And Chester Jr. doesn't say this, but he claims later in his oral history that he thought to himself, well, you've got a radio. Why don't you ask him? But Nimitz, the admiral, did not want to look over Halsey's shoulder. He didn't want his subordinates to think he was monitoring their every move. And so he held back. Now, is that a criticism of Nimitz? I suppose that it probably is. And then the next night, when they're talking about the fact that Halsey had made this terrible mistake, Chester Jr. asks him, well, what orders did he have? Did he have permission to do that? And his father said, well, yes, I wrote that into the orders. And the son says, and I don't know the tone of voice he used, he says, well, then it's your fault. Wow.
Wow, yeah.
And the father says, and again, we don't know the tone of voice. The father says, well, that's your opinion.
Yeah.
When I wrote that, my editor at Oxford had me change the sentence to read, the father snapped back at him. That's your opinion. I don't think Nimitz snapped very often at anybody, and not his son either. I think he probably said it, well, that's your opinion.
Yeah.
We don't know.
And then, Craig, the icing on the cake in this story is finally a communication is sent to Halsey via the Navy channels, right? And there's this famous padding story that gets played out. And
yeah, it's probably the most famous story of the whole Second World War, certainly the most famous of the Pacific War. For those who don't know, and most of you probably do already, when a naval message is sent out, the junior officer who sends it, sometimes enlisted man, puts padding on the front and the back. And there was a big book full of nonsense phrases. Mary had a little lamb or whatever. They just would stick this on the beginning and the end, and they'd separate it from the message with a double consonant. In this case, GG and RR, so that you would know not to deliver that to the recipient. But the padding on the end of the message was the world, the whole world wonders. And the recipient on Halsey's flagship, it was on Halsey's command staff, read that and thought, boy, that sounds like the message. Where is Task Force 34 RR? The world wonders. And that's how it was delivered up to Halsey, who absolutely freaked out, threw it on the desk, stomped on it, started swearing. His chief of staff had to grab him by the shoulders and shake him. What's the matter with you? Get a hold of yourself. So yeah, this famous message where Nimitz finally says, well, I'm not going to tell him what to do. I'm not going to interfere with his operations. I'm just going to ask a simple question. But even that had, as we've seen, a profound impact on Halsey's attitude.
Yeah, it's just a wonderful story. And like you say, I think it's one of the most interesting and famous stories, at least of the Pacific War, if not the entire. So I see it's 8:30, and like some of our guests, I'd love to go till 1:30 or 2:30, but I'm supposing that's not going to be possible. Todd, other couple of questions from the audience before we wrap this up?
We have Peter Innocent, a Marine, who asks, in regard to Wake Island, did Nimitz have time or resources for a relief operation?
Short answer is no. The relief operation had already been recalled by Admiral Pye before Nimitz ever got to Pearl Harbor. When he landed from his seaplane in Pearl Harbor, the boat that came out to pick him up, Nimitz climbed down into the boat. And the first thing he said was, any news from Wake Island? And the officer who greeted him said, the rescue operation has been recalled. So that happened before Nimitz was in a position to have anything to say about it.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Craig. No other questions. Anybody have any other questions for Craig before we wrap up?
I have a wrap-up story I'd like Craig to relate, because I thought it was just incredibly fascinating, if we're ready to wrap it up.
I thought I saw a hand flash up. Bob Flage, was that you? No. Okay. Okay, go on.
So the war ends. Nimitz becomes eventually CNO in 47 or so, I can't remember, leads a post-military life. He passes away in 1964, something like that, Craig?
Something like that, yeah.
All right. And what I found just incredibly poignant was where he's buried and who he's buried with. And I guarantee you, the next time I'm in California, I'm going there.
Yeah, San Bruno Cemetery. It's just over the line from the city of San Francisco. It's a national cemetery for veterans. And the thought was, well, he'll be buried at Arlington and we'll have a big monument and an obelisk and all of this stuff. And he said, no. Here's what we're going to do. I want to be buried with my sailors and my Marines. And I want my stone to be exactly the same size and exactly the same format as all of theirs. And so I wanted to be in California overlooking the ocean with my sailors and Marines. And his chief of staff at the time, Raymond Spruant, said, I want in on that. And later on, Charlie Lockwood, who commanded Pacific Submarine, said, me too. So Nimitz bought 6 plots at San Bruno with the requirement that his stone look exactly like everybody else's. So if you go there, you will find Nimitz and Spruant's and Lockwood, and quite nearby Richmond Kelly Turner as well, because he didn't get in on the original purchase, but he found out about it and bought the 2 closest plots. They're all within 10 feet of one another, well, 20 feet of one another. But you have to look because they look exactly like everybody else's stone.
And, you know, my thought was to overuse a phrase, what a band of brothers.
Yeah.
Decided to stay together for immortality. So.
Yep. Very good.
Susie Gilliland, thank you for letting me know that Richard Everington had a question. Richard, another Marine.
Yeah, how's it going? Has there been a book written, or is there any explanation why the Japanese admirals were so bad? including Yamamoto, because he didn't stipulate that the oil tanks, the gasoline tanks on Honolulu get destroyed.
Yeah, you know, that's a
Why?
great
What happened?
question. And there are some. The best book that gives the Japanese perspective on the Battle of Midway is John Parshall and Tony Tilley's book, Shattered Sword. And there are others. Jeffrey Cox has written a couple of books about the Japanese perspective. I think the key here is understanding Japanese culture, because it's not that the admirals were bad, but that they were a reflection of the culture from which they emerged, as ours were too, and still are, which is why it's important that we keep our original values close to our heart. The Japanese believed being a warrior meant going on the offensive. So anybody who defends himself is an idiot. Anybody who allows himself to be captured is a coward. So you must die in combat. And these were self-defeating cultural values. The Japanese admirals, in some cases, were quite brilliant, and Yamamoto among them, but they were all products of their culture, as we are too. And so I think that's understanding our own culture as well as that of others is an important element in being successful as a nation.
Thanks. Appreciate that.
Carolyn Royce, you have a question about Netflix.
Craig, I have really enjoyed watching you on those Netflix documentaries. And I'm wondering if there's more coming, because I've watched those 2 seasons over and over, and I know there's a ton more stories. Please tell me you have more in the works.
What a great question. I don't know is the short answer.
No.
I get called by these people. They say, come to a studio. We have questions for you. So I show up
yes,
and I
please.
sit there in front of a camera just like this, and they throw questions at me just like you are. And they film it, and then they use it in subsequent broadcasts. But I have no control over where or when or how or when it's shown. So I recently sat down with them for 3 hours or more in Washington, D.C. in a studio. So I assume those comments will come out at some point in some broadcast somewhere. I'm glad you're enjoying it. Thank you for that.
Oh, they're phenomenal, and your research is amazing.
Oh, well, thank you.
And your book is fantastic.
Okay, well,
great.
I
So,
have
Carolyn,
really
that's good
enjoyed
news.
this. Thank you, Glenn, and everybody else. I see there are a lot of participants. I sorry we didn't get a chance to talk to all of you. My wife is holding dinner for me.
Oh,
So I'm going to go off and have some lasagna, if that's okay with everybody. And I wish everybody a happy holiday and a joyous new year. And thanks for the opportunity to talk.
Thank you, Craig. What a treat. Thank you for coming on. We appreciate it. Thank you, Glenn, for hosting. Thanks to all of you. I hope you join us again next Monday night, December 19th, for our VBC Happy Hour, our open conversation. Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you. Thank you,
Take care.
Craig, very, very much.